And a very warm welcome to this conversation on agile leadership. Today, we have the privilege and the opportunity to have with us no other than Dave Snowden, founder and chief scientific officer at Cognitive Edge. Dave is also the mind behind the groundbreaking Cynefin Framework, which is a sense-making tool that supports decision-making by identifying which problem domain we're really in and how we can prepare better to navigate through that domain. So very warm welcome, Dave, and very early morning for you.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much. As I can see, you're ready to go somewhere or read somewhere, but I'm seeing that you're safe. Thank you so much for having time to be with us this morning.
That's no problem.
Wonderful. So we're going to start, Dave, with the opportunity to go a little deeper for some of our listeners today who may not be aware of the Cynefin framework. Would you tell us a little bit about the framework and how we use it for decision making?
Okay, so the base level framework has three different types of system. Ordered systems, complex systems, and chaotic systems. And the best metaphor for that is solid, liquid, and gas. So order is solid, it's predictable, it's reliable, it's stable. Yeah. Complex is liquid, it's more fluid, it's more difficult to contain. And chaos is gas, it's effectively random. The other key thing which comes out of that is that there are phase shift transitions. So if you heat water up to 100 degrees, it doesn't become steam until you put more heat in. That's called latent heat. Yeah, so there's an energy gradient between those three domains. And as anybody remembers their high school physics, you know there's a thing called the triple point, which is a stable position between pressure and temperature, where it's equiprobable that something can become solid, liquid, or gas. And in Cynefin, that's the central domain, which is called the aporetic. It's a state where you don't know what you could be or what you're doing. And that's actually quite a good place to start. It's kind of like openness. And then there are some other aspects of Cynefin. So the ordered domain splits into two, simple and complicated, which relates to the relationship between cause and effect. And at advanced levels, there are also liminal subdomains. But it is heart, it's order, complex chaos, and this aporetic state of deliberate uncertainty, which allows you to make choices about where you go.
So we're going to go a little deeper, Dave, on the concept and how do we apply that framework into decision making in the context of business. And I think one of the big highlights of the course that we did last batch on design thinking and agile was your framework, and people really found it extremely useful to think about problem solving and really look at the context around them in a very different way. And I can see many of you joining us from different places in LinkedIn. It'll be great if you let us know where you're joining us from. I can see many hellos and good mornings and good afternoons. Just let us know which city, which country are you joining from. We get a sense about the diversity of the room. So Dave, tell us a little bit how we use that framework in the context of business.
I think there are two things that I've always disliked. Right, well, actually, there's a lot of things I've always disliked in management theory, but two in particular. One is this sort of one size fits all. People discover the magic mystery potion, and now everybody has, for example, to be a servant leader, or everybody has to be X, Y, Z. And I'm old enough to have lived through all of these fads over the years. They come, they go. And Agile, to some extent, is going down the same route. It becomes a minority thing, then a majority, then it dies. Yeah. And one of the things Cynefin is about is recognizing that different things work at different times in boundaries. So there was nothing wrong, for example, with business process reengineering or even Six Sigma, provided you kept it in core manufacturing. There was everything wrong with it if you applied it to a service relationship, which was a complex one. So there are things which work in order and things which work in complex. Yeah, a leader in an ordered domain, a leader is in quite an interesting position because in the ordered domain, you're either making or imposing processes, or you're trusting or relying on expert judgment. In the complex domain, you're actually running lots of parallel safe to fail experiments to see what's possible. And in the chaotic domain, that's actually the only time you really make a decision as a leader, which is to create stability. In fact, one of the phrases in the European Commission's handbook on crisis management, which I wrote, says that actually a leader only makes decisions in a crisis. After that, they coordinate. So you delegate decision making, but you coordinate decision makers. So Cynefin is all about diversity, about doing different things in different contexts. And it's not a one size fits all approach.
Yeah, yeah. How do we use the model in a way? So the model is really to help us define which context we are in and how we need to act
Yeah,
upon that context.
the petty point is a framework, not a model, but that is actually quite important.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
That's all right. Don't worry. I made that mistake at the start as well and got corrected. So you learn these things, all right? I think let's take an example, all right? You're a decision maker, right? You're faced with, and I was a C-level exec, right? For a lot of my career. And you get 8 or 9 groups come into your room for a meeting. They've all researched their ideas. They're all equally valid.
Yeah.
How the hell do you make a decision? And generally you have about 3 or 5 minutes to make a decision. So the way Cynefin works is much simpler. You say, okay, what aspects of this context are ordered? And if they're ordered, well, who's got the expertise, or have we got a process? Well, why are you bothering me with this? You know what to do.
Yeah.
Right? So that gets rid of a whole bunch of stuff. Right? If it's complex, all of those people with different competing ideas, you stop trying to resolve that because you can't. You haven't got time to do the investigation. You give each of them a small amount of resource, so they run parallel safe to fail experiments over weeks or at the most a few months.
Yeah.
And what will happen then, you only give that to people with coherent ideas, by the way, you don't give it to any idea. But what will then happen is the decision space will change as a result of the experiments.
Yeah.
And it will become more obvious what you want to do. So the key essence of Cynefin is break it down to what's called the lowest level of coherent granularity, decide which domain it's in, and then make decisions accordingly.
So tell us about what's chaos. Is chaos something that it's as big as pandemic, or is chaos can be something as small as a crisis with a customer?
Okay.
How do we define chaos really?
There is no agreement on the meaning of the term. All right. So physicists use it differently from social scientists, use it differently from modelers. So it's a young field. All right. So I'm not talking about what a mathematician would call deterministic chaos. I'm using chaos to mean the absence of any effective constraint. So that there are no constraints in place. Everything appears random. Everything appears confused. So if that happens accidentally, it's a major crisis.
Yeah.
If you can deliberately create it, and a lot of our work is to create a situation where there are no constraints or no connectivity, it can be a useful decision support tool. But a lot of people get it wrong. So, I mean, I've been in Mumbai, I've been in many Indian cities, all right? And I know if you walk across the road at a constant pace without looking sideways, you won't get hit by cars. And that's actually a complex system. It's not a chaotic system.
Yeah.
Because everything's working off very simple. It's actually a flocking algorithm if you study it. It's, follow the next car, match speed, avoid collision. And everybody is driving on that basis. So the whole system largely self-organizes. Yeah. So chaos is only ever a temporary state for humans. Yeah. And to create it takes a hell of a lot of energy. Yeah. It's rather like fusion drives. All right. The energy required to contain the plasma is more than the energy you get out of it.
Yeah. So you were sharing as an example, and I'm going a little again on that same example, the difference between how do you look at a problem and pick up the areas that are complicated and really think about who has the expertise, as opposed to the complex areas where you run parallel experiments, as you were saying, on those ideas that are coherent. What is the role that we have as team leaders or product owners? How do we architect these conversations so then we can enable our teams to be more successful on the complicated problems and on the complex problems as well?
Okay, so complex on complicated problems, all right, that's where you need proper qualifications. Yeah. And there's no excuse for not having those. And by the way, doing a 2-day course and then an open book exam on multi-choice questionnaire over the next 3 weeks isn't a qualification.
Yeah.
And it's certainly not mastery of anything, right?
Yeah.
I mean, real qualifications, right? Which includes things like experience. Yeah. So in the complicated domain, the issue is who's got the expertise, trust them, give them the space, give them the resource. Yeah. If you have competing expertise, which is a frequent problem, where different groups of experts from different backgrounds disagree, but you know they're right or they're right in combination. We have a whole process for that called a triopticon, which is a 1-day highly orchestrated dance between experts and minor experts so that a leader can see the decision process. Yeah. But a team leader is very rarely going to face that. That's kind of like executive decision making or government decision making. We saw a lot of it in the pandemic with arguments between behavioral economists and epidemiologists, for example.
Correct.
I say then if it's complex, yeah, you basically say, okay, guys, who's got a hypothesis about what we should do? Yeah. I'm not interested in whether you're right or wrong. I just want to know, is it a coherent hypothesis? Yeah. Now, coherence is a key word, right? So we know, for example, that evolutionary theory is wrong because we keep discovering new things. Yeah. But evolutionary theory is coherent to the facts, therefore it's a journey worth taking. Whereas young Earth creationism is incoherent to the facts, so there's no point in pursuing it. If anybody is offended by that, then as a good Catholic, I couldn't care less, all right? You're just in the wrong, right? So you test for coherence, and then we have forms you can fill in for this. So it's kind of like, what's the experiment? What will we do if it starts to fail? What will we do if it starts to succeed? Yeah, what resource do we need? What the time frame is, and you basically trigger those as a series. It's critical they're parallel. Yeah, if you do one experiment, it will always succeed. It's called the Hawthorne effect. So it's those parallel experiments. And we actually technically call them probes, not experiments. Yeah. Because you're probing the space to see what's possible. And to be honest, even if you're a team leader in a small group, you can do that over 24 hours. You know, go away and do this, then come back and we'll talk about it again. So it's a massive conflict resolution device. Yeah. So I can agree, I mean, I may think you're wrong, but I can agree your idea is coherent. And all I need at this stage is that level of consensus. So people don't overcommit to ideas too quickly. And those are the two main aspects of it. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave. Sorry.
Well, now there's a good question come up from Shivani in the thing about, you know, decisions at the top are driven by gut feel. That's the problem. Yeah. So because you have got very little time to make a decision, you just say this one feels right or that guy was right last time. That's a very poor basis for decision making. So Cynefin changes that, yeah, in that you make a series of gut decisions based on coherence and you see what happens, right? So it's a different type of rationality. It's designed to create a pragmatic approach to rational decision making.
So one of the words you used a little earlier was the word trust. And trust is a word that I think it's widely used and maybe not so practiced many times. What does that mean, and how do we really use trust in solution making?
It's more abused actually than used, all right? I think the problem is trust is won over long periods of working together and it can be lost in seconds. Yeah. I mean, I lost it this morning. I saw somebody post something on Facebook, which was basically a lie. And I've known this guy for ages, but that's it. Okay, forget it now, right? Yeah. And he'll never know. Yeah. Because I don't want to bring attention to it, right? Yeah. And that's one of the problems you've got, is that trust is never overt. And when team leaders say we all work together, trust is a key part of what we do, you kind of like know they're doomed, all right? Because if you have to talk about trust, it's not present. It's in fact, a lot of the things that we see as beneficial cultural things, the minute you start to talk about them, it's evidence they don't exist and they won't exist again. Yeah, organizations don't need purpose statements if they've got purpose. If they need a purpose statement, they're probably becoming purposeless. Right? So this tyranny of trying to make everything explicit is a problem. Now, one of the key mechanisms for generating trust is actually informal networks. So a lot of our work is to build in informal networks across silos, because if you've worked with people together in an intensive environment, you trust them, and you open up a communication channel which is context-free. Now, in a crisis, most communication channels are context-specific. They're designed with a specific flow in mind, whereas an informal network is context-free. And so when we've seen this during the pandemic, the thing which really worked for people was their informal networks.
Yeah.
But then there's a big contrast here. So I was on a call with Singapore the other day, right? Where I've done a lot of work at PS level and elsewhere. In fact, we're a Singapore-based company, yeah? And everybody in Singapore goes through national service. So their informal networks come from the officers or the sergeant's mess in that period, all through military service. So it's a meritocratic informal network. It can work very quickly. In my own country, all right, and I wish to make it clear I'm Welsh. We were England's first and hopefully will be their last colony. You know, one of these days we'll get independence. But the informal networks are created by being attendants at one or two elite private schools. So the informal networks are not actually meritocratic. They're actually elitist.
Yeah.
So a large part of what, you know, this method called entangled trios is you need to build informal networks across silos. And particularly in the PM role, your informal networks need to be both technical and user.
Yeah.
Because the informal networks have trust built into their nature, so you can get better information through them. It's not that you abandon the formal processes, but you need both.
So in this journey of enabling teams and enabling leaders to create those networks and this, you mentioned normally in your work you talk about enabling conditions, and I think that's really, I think for that matter, probably the intent of any business entrepreneur or any organization to really enable people to be able to serve their customers, to be able to innovate. And in that process, probably we get lost somewhere and we start creating structures that actually create the opposite. So how do we understand this process of really enabling people's potential as opposed to controlling with and I would still say it's the intent is not really to control, but it ends up controlling and not enabling people to fulfill their potential.
And it's a major problem. We did work in the north of England with blue light services. So these are fire officers, police firearms officers, and ambulance drivers. And we found the main cause of mental breakdown wasn't actually the job, it was the health and safety regulations.
Yeah.
Because the rules have been developed on the assumption that the distribution of events followed a normal distribution, whereas actually the distribution followed a Pareto distribution. There was a fat tail. So most events were taking place outside the compass of the rules, but you were in trouble if you didn't follow the rules. So nurses, for example, have to break the rules 3 or 4 times a day in order to provide empathetic care. So the excessive imposition of rigid constraints can damage employees' capability. All right. But the absence of constraints is also equally problematic. All right. And some constraints work better than others. I always say transparency is not a goal. If you have too much transparency, nobody will act because they won't take risks. If you have no transparency, you get corruption. So there's this is Aristotle's golden mean, if you want to go back to philosophy. Yeah. So a lot of the principle of what you're trying to do is to create. So, for example, one of the things we do with entangled trios, I mean, this is actually how we organize as a company. So everybody is in a trio with 2 other people, and if the 3 agree, you can act. There's no need for process. Nice. But there's a constraint on the interaction, which means you've got some accountability. Yeah, but it's not consensus because the trios all overlap, and therefore the system manages itself by coordination. Right? Now, what we've done there is we've created a minimal level process. And this isn't like things like holacracy, all right, for example, which are actually quite disastrous because they're so process-based and so bureaucratic that they reward people who are good at bureaucracy rather than people who can make spontaneous decisions. Yeah. So I think that there's all sorts of ways we can create constraints, which means we don't have to worry too much about trust because we've designed the system so that trust naturally flows within context.
So the challenge with design of enabling structures is that it's just not one thing. It has to be a entangle multiple
Mm-hmm.
things that need to make it consistent, right? It's not that, oh, I loved Dave's idea about if three people agree, then go ahead and take it. But that needs to be successful in a context where there is probably multiple other principles or ways of working that are accepted by the group.
It's not just any three people either. So, for example, we're doing one in the States at the moment. So we've identified 20 roles.
Yeah.
So you've got things like doctor, teacher, community
Yeah.
worker, nurse.
Yeah.
And so we define them in pairs where they can see they should work together, like a doctor and
Yeah.
a community worker. And then
Yeah.
they choose the third member from the other roles.
Nice.
All right. So diversity is designed into the system.
Yeah.
And by the way, that because the roles are part of the formal system, it connects the formal to the informal very quickly. So it's a weak signal detection device, right? So, I mean, design is critical on this, and this is what we call theory-based design.
Yeah.
We know the theory of networks, and we know how human beings make decisions in the main and how they don't make decisions. So we design consistency with that, right? And if you want a metaphor for this, it's if you look at say a forest plantation, yeah, what you'll find is the tree roots are connected by fungal roots. And the fungal roots spread 500 times further than the tree roots, and it's a symbiosis. So they provide water and nutrients to the tree, and they get sucrose back in return. Now, the trees are visible, that's the formal system.
Correct.
The fungal roots are invisible, they're the informal system, but the connectivity makes the whole system work.
Yeah.
So it's that it's recognizing difference, which is key. And if we look at business goals, I mean, you've got business goals. I mean, I've been a general manager. You can have all the desire you want, but if you don't turn in those numbers next quarter, you're going to lose your job. And you keep trying to explain to people, you spend 90% of your time protecting them from company bureaucracy. That's the role of a middle leader, right? Is protecting your own staff from the idiots, right? So that's one type of constraint, and you have to work within it, right? And I think mapping, I mean, one of the big things we do is to map constraints.
Yeah.
So you don't start with where you want to be. I mean, that's the classic major problem with systems thinking. And for the last 4 decades, we've been dominated by systems thinking, where everybody gets together and talks about things in a workshop, decide how things should be, and then assume it will somehow magically happen, right? It's talk before doing, right? We take a different approach. We map the territory, and then we do things, and then we talk about it. So it's map, do, talk, not talk, do, map, right? Now that sequence means you're working with the realities of the situation and moving it forwards, rather than try and create these very artificial definitions of the future.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Dave. Thanks so much for that. And I think there's a question, and you're kind of answering it by describing what a PM actually does and how that role looks like. But if you were to list some leadership qualities, there's a question specifically about how would those leaders look like? How will you define them?
Right. I mean, I actually think this is one of the dead ends of organizational change, the identification of qualities and properties, right?
Yeah.
So Steve Denning, who always seems to write books towards the end of a life cycle, wrote a book called Radical Leadership, right?
Yeah.
And he talks about Steve Jobs from Apple, right? He talks about GE, and he talks about IBM, right?
Yeah.
Now, I work with all 3 CEOs. I mean, not much with Steve Jobs. I had one meeting and I had a pile of books thrown at me and he swore at me, right? So that's my claim to fame, all right? But I did leadership development with Lou Gerstner. I did extensive work on innovation in GE. Now, none of them had anything in common.
Yeah.
Apart from the fact they were arrogant bastards. and they ignored anybody they didn't like, right? So that was the only, but you're not going to get that in a book of leadership qualities.
Yeah.
You're going to get a series of platitudes. The reality is leaders are catalysts in the system, right? And actually anybody can lead. They don't have to have essential qualities. There are things it's useful to have as a human being, like the ability to listen to people, to the ability to think diversely. If you read a lot of books from multiple backgrounds, if you read science fiction, if you read novels, you're actually a better decision maker because you're drawing on broader patterns, without even thinking about it consciously. So there are things you can do to improve yourself as a human being. Empathy is a key quality, but you can't train these. They arise out of things you do. So the important thing is stop talking and start doing, and then talk. I think that's kind of like the key split.
So tell me more about this iterative approach. And you spoke about picking those ideas from diverse, cohesive hypotheses, but diverse viewpoints of how to take a problem forward. How do we shift? And I think, of course, the pandemic has helped us in a way to change that mind of one plan, one being bang approach to problem solve, to really that iterative approach as well. How do we create that safety for people to fail? Because, of course, if we're going to start multiple projects at the same time, we need to build that ability for people to feel comfortable with failure and learning from that failure to move forward.
I think that's, I understand that, right? But the problem is, and I see a lot of this in the Agile community, they see we need to be a company which recognise failure.
Yeah.
We need to create psychological failure. If you fail, don't worry about it, talk about it, right? That's a Darwinian technique to eliminate the fatally naive early on in their career. I mean, it will never work in practice, right? Again, this is my point. You need to build processes which produce the qualities you want rather than berate people with those qualities. If you have 8 safe to fail probes and people haven't committed to the probe, it's just, this is coherent, we'll try it.
Yeah.
And if you put diverse trios onto the implementation of the probe, actually the expectation is some of them will fail.
Yeah.
So failure is part, and military people get this straight away. You send out a probe, it may fail, but the failure will teach you things, right?
Yeah.
So I think the failure world is wrong. I think it's more a learning process, right?
Yeah.
If you say, but if somebody, if somebody loses you a hell of a lot of money over a year, they failed, sorry. And if they've learned from it, that's fine, but you're still going to fire them, right? Because there are limits on that. And if you don't do that, you're not exercising leadership judgment. I mean, you're not there to be liked. That's the other thing leaders need to understand, all right? If you want to be a leader, it's not about everybody loving you and you giving them psychological safety and listening to their problems. I mean, you've got to do a bit of that, and you've got to be empathetic and sympathetic, but you've also got to manage the total ecosystem of which they're a part, which includes senior leadership, shareholder expectations, yet users. A complete tangent here, but one of the techniques we're bringing back at the moment, we just gone open source on all our methods, and I'm bringing back time boxes, which we used a lot in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
So a time box says we will deliver on this date. The date will never shift, right? But there's a minimal viable product and a maximum achievable product, and there's a minimal level of resource and a maximum level of resource. So we as a team guarantee on this date, you will get at least the MVP for this resource. It'll probably be somewhere between the team. Now that's a damn sight more effective than Scrum in some situations where you never have a date. So in a large multi-project team, and most users want dates for something rather than trust us, right? So there are lots and lots of different techniques we can use in different ways. And this is a key aspect. Stop talking about the qualities of people. Build processes which create those qualities naturally. It's kind of like the lesson.
Yeah. How I think the creative process of building those processes itself is, I think, what can become challenging for us to understand, because of course, as you mentioned, there is no one way to build those processes. You'll really need to look at What's the problem
Yeah,
we're
but
trying to face? And
complexity design is a lot simpler, actually, because
yeah,
it takes an ecological metaphor, not a manufacturing metaphor.
yeah,
So if you've lived through the tyranny of Six Sigma
yeah,
or the inauthentic nonsense of something like SAFe, then you've implemented something which is way too complicated for any
correct,
real world situation.
correct,
Complexity
correct.
probably has 3 or 4 small things that you do and you see what happens, right? So complexity is actually an easier, lower energy cost intervention, but it does require it requires the ability to think in slightly different ways. And the metaphor is key. Again, one of the real problems with Agile is it keeps using methods derived from manufacturing and manufacturing methods. Yeah, it talks about product and process and lean. And yeah, lean isn't confined to manufacturing, but in the way people
Yeah,
implement it, it always is.
yeah,
You need to
yeah,
think that you're managing a garden, you're not managing a machine plant. And, gardeners do small things and wait for the results. They create boundary
yeah.
areas. They create safe space for wildflowers. They do and really good leaders, and I've worked with a lot over my years, yeah, they've always got time because they're not micromanaging. What they're doing is they're creating the conditions and linking and connecting people.
If we look at our business as this garden, how do we build more colleagues who actually can create those governing or enabling conditions so it multiplies and it doesn't depend only on that garden keeper?
I think it's training, and I think we've lost the concept of apprenticeship.
Yeah,
So actually,
yeah,
modern apprenticeships, you learn more by doing in a very small team
yeah,
than you do by being taught the qualities.
yeah,
So, we do something, for example, called transgenerational pairing. So we put people in their first 3 months of joining, they have to keep a learning journal. We have software for this.
yeah,
Yeah, start and end of the day. And every week they're given jobs to go and interview more experienced staff, which is, by the way, the way you capture knowledge from older staff. They won't respond to a consultant, but somebody who's just joined the company, they'll tell them everything. It's called the grandparent syndrome. Yeah, grandparents tell things to their grandchildren they don't tell to their children. And they're a peer group, so they're sharing those stories, and so we're connecting young with old and creating it horizontally with stories. Now, those story databases are actually a hugely valuable knowledge asset, but we're also linking and connecting people across experience generations in different ways. So we're building that network capability and understanding. And this is why I say complexity, once you get it, is
yeah,
actually fairly simple. In a traditional knowledge management program, you'd have a knowledge management officer, a codified database. You'd be saying, how the hell do we get these old people to contribute their knowledge because they won't do it?
yeah,
And this is what Cynefin is about. You're using an ordered systems approach in what is a complex domain. So,
yeah,
yeah, there's a British phrase, horses for courses, right? If you're going to bet on a horse, check the conditions of the ground first.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Wonderful. So I have a question here related to leadership. I think it was about communication in particular. And I think as what will be your advice specifically for the HR community that needs to support this garden to change the way we are working? And I know you're quite critical with the HR community, but
Yeah, I
I
started
love
my
to.
career in HR. I was my first job was in HR, right? Before I moved on to finance. But in my days, HR was generally run by an ex-military officer with a couple of assistants
Yeah.
and a secretary. And most departments did their own HR. It's now become a whole industry, right? And I'm doing a big seminar next month, actually, for the STOA, where I'm going through all the idiocies I've seen from HR in my career. I sort of volunteered. I mentioned this casually and they've seized on it, all right? Having worked in IBM for 7 years, I've got lots of examples. So there are some things you should stop doing, like these nonsensical salary profiles. Yeah, so we have this, we say all of your staff should follow this profile. So you get this much money, you code your people as ABC. Now, I had a high-performing team when I was in software development, all right? It was 15 people. We were the most profitable business unit 7 years on the run, all right? And that takes something. I never had to recruit outside because people joined internally because we gave people autonomy, all right? And that rumor got around. And then I got told that I had to have this profile. So although I had high performers, I had profit, I could pay for it. So what I did was to take on a massive project with a lot of contractors so I could have people, I could pay nothing. So I could pay the other people. The energy I put into working around the system was massive, right?
Yeah.
So HR departments need to know when to trust people and when not to, when you need process and when you don't.
Yeah.
And I call it the tyranny of the explicit. HR departments seem to have this panic that if something is explicit, it's not being managed. And often if you make things explicit, you lose the capacity to manage them, right? So I think for HR departments, it's more what they should stop doing, yeah, and what they should start doing, which is key.
Wonderful. Thanks, Dave. And I think that's one of the key messages that we have as well as part of the program that we do for the HR community to really think differently and build those mindsets. And I'm so full of gratitude that you gave us also those inputs for the program as well. And many of our leaders will get the opportunity to see those videos as well. So it's more about what we have to stop doing and really creating those enabling conditions for people to do the best they can for our customers.
And it is quite interesting. I mean, I had the privilege of teaching leadership with Peter Drucker before he died, all right, which was huge, right? And when I got badly beaten up first, but he decided I was redeemable and took me out for dinner, right? One of the things we both agreed on is that scientific management, which are people in Agile berate, largely because they don't understand it. Actually, in scientific management, if you go back to Taylor, managers stayed in companies for life and there were full apprentice systems and most decisions were made by people. Yeah, it wasn't the tyranny people think it was. What happened when systems thinking came along in the 80s and we switched to an engine? So you had a military metaphor in scientific management. Yeah. And military systems are actually very adaptive. Sergeants can boss brigadiers in some contexts, right? So we went from a military metaphor based on apprenticeship and learning into an engineering metaphor where everything had to be structured. And that's, to be honest, where things went wrong. In complexity, we're coming back, but now we're taking this ecological metaphor. But human judgment becomes important within constraints. Yeah. And I noticed, I mean, in DataSolve, which I worked for, then Data Sciences and IBM, it was all the same company progressively. As I got promoted more and more, my authority actually went down and down. So I had more authority, before, because actually we were getting more and more consultancy-led initiatives, more and more controls. Yeah. And so I had less and less autonomy to make decisions. So I got more and more clever about working around the system. Yeah. So my key quality as a manager was to work around the system, not to work with the system. Right? Yeah. So constraint, I can't overemphasize this. Mapping constraints is key. Once you know what the constraints are, then you can decide which you relax, which you change, and you can see what happens. You never, ever start with how you want to be. Yeah, if you do that, you are doomed. And everybody in Agile keeps talking about this. We want to be an Agile organization. We want an Agile transformation. How do I get my senior leadership to transform themselves so I can transform? Those are all the wrong questions. Yeah, you should be saying, what do I have to do so that people can see that this works? Yeah. All right. And that's a very different approach. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think as we close, almost reaching 40 minutes of conversation, it looks like we've just been speaking for 5. But Dave, I want to conclude by inviting you to help us see the pandemic as an opportunity to really make those shifts in terms of the conversations and the questions. And sometimes, the mind tends to want to go back to the past, and we've seen different countries at different stages of COVID situation. And we have many leaders joining us from India, which is still another second or third wave in the middle of it right now. How do we use this as an opportunity to really reframe the way we think about teams?
I think there's several things, right? First of all, you've got to stop using case-based approaches to management. They never really worked anyway. So somebody would go and study 15 companies and would identify things they did and create a recipe. I mean, Good to Great, for example, loads of people copied, but every company mentioned has now failed. But they conveniently ignore that. All right. Now, post-COVID, using cases is even more contraindicated because the past is not going to repeat. So this is where we talk about theory-informed practice. Now, the EU Field Guide on how to managing complexity in crisis is a free download. Anybody can download that. It's the first major government endorsement of a fully complexity-based approach to organizational design. We are launching with that an assessment process for strategy and an assessment process for HR, which is based on the Field Guide, which people can run for themselves with some coaching. So, that to my mind is the culmination of 30 years work. And COVID has triggered the need for it. Yeah. So there are things you can follow and things you can do. Yeah. But the key thing is, take the gardening metaphor. A gardener sometimes knows that they will get blight. They have to replant. Yeah. They have to keep a wildflower gardener. They don't get genetic variety. Yeah. You can do an awful lot by putting water in place or putting stones for people to stand on. It's that sort of metaphor which should inform you. So if you really want to go and work as an apprentice to a Japanese gardener for a couple of weeks and then come back and be a manager, that's probably better than doing an MBA.
Wonderful, wonderful, Dave. And I love always your provocative way of thinking and your diverse approach to really look at alternative ways of thinking. So thank you so much for being with us. It's always a pleasure, and I personally learn a lot when I hear you. And I once again thank you for taking time so early in the morning to be with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dave. And thanks, everyone. I can see Shivani already inviting all of you to think about what is the one key takeaway from this conversation with Dave this morning. And I love to see what has been the one big takeaway as we say bye-bye to Dave. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day ahead. Thank you for joining us, Dave.
Thanks.
Take care. All right, so let me see what all big takeaways from today, and I'm going to invite you as well to see the program that we're starting. As you know, we're starting a program on these different mindsets that Dave spoke about, and we actually title it Design Thinking and Agile as a way for us to really look at what all we're going to cover. But the program is, of course, not prescriptive. The program is trying to help us think about what are the new ways that we can enable our organization agility with the objective to be closer to our customers, to be closer to the needs of the business as well. So the program starts on Monday, and Dave is one of our lead faculty members as well. And we welcome you. We're going to be closing registrations probably by Thursday. So in case you're interested, I'm inviting the team to put the link as well. I think Shivani has already put it in the chat. And we welcome you all to join us in this journey to become that gardener and really nurture not only our teams, but also our leaders to be able to prepare and be ready for the next phase of our business. So thank you so much for joining us once again, and we'll see you very soon at the People Matters BeNext program that starts on Monday. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.